Okay, so welcome to the January 26th, 2023 RPC TAC Transportation Advisory Committee meeting. First thing on the agenda is to go through and do introductions, and I'll just read off the names of folks in the order that I have them here, and we can everybody can say who they are and who they're representing. So start with the one person who's joined us in the room, Dave.
Dave Sharples, town planner accident.
All right, thanks. Tim Moore.
Yep, Tim Moore from Huston.
All right, thanks, Tim. Good to see you back. Bob. All right, so we're still unsure who Bob is. Okay, Eric.
Eric Eby, transportation engineer, City of Portsmouth.
All right, welcome, Eric. Jen.
Jen Hale, Director, Hampton DPW.
All right, hi, Jen. Jessica.
Good morning, Jessica Wilcox with New Hampshire DES.
Morning. Lee.
Morning, everybody. Lee Levine, Federal Highway Administration.
All right, hi, Lee. Mark.
Good morning, Mark Connors, town of Streatham.
Hi, Mark. Peter.
Peter Coffening, Kingston Planning Board.
All right, hi, Peter. Rad.
Rad Nichols, Coast.
All right, morning. And then Sarah.
Hi, Sarah Tatarzik. Excuse me, my voice is not doing great this morning. Sarah Tatarzik with the Rockingham Planning Commission.
Morning, Sarah. All right, and then we'll go back to Bob.
Okay, I think I'm here this time.
All
I
right.
was muted before. I apologize. I'm the new commissioner from Greenland. My name is Bob Diane.
Your name broke up there at the end, Bob.
Bob Diane.
All right.
Okay.
All
Did
right,
you hear
thanks. Yep. All right, and then just joining us is Ricky DeCillo from DES as well. All right. All right, Ricky, maybe you could just introduce yourself real quick. You're the last one here.
Morning, everyone. Ricky DeCillo, New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services.
All right, thanks, Ricky. All right. First item on the agenda is the minutes of the October 27th meeting. I should say the next item.
I'll move, this is Peter Coffin. I'll move that we accept the minutes as submitted.
Second.
All right, thanks. All right, unfortunately, we have to go through and do the roll call voting. And Bill Watson is joining us from DOT. Morning, Bill. Could you just introduce yourself? Maybe when you get your audio connected. Bill is still connecting to audio. All right. It's like DOT's having some struggles. Yeah, I got an email from Lucy saying she's having trouble connecting. So, well, we'll keep moving forward, I guess. All right, so I'm going to go through and do the roll call vote on the minutes. We'll start with Dave.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Tim Moore.
Abstain.
Abstain. Bob.
I also will abstain. I was not there.
Eric.
Yes.
All right, thanks. Jen.
Yes.
All right, thanks. Jessica.
Yes.
All right. Lee is a non-voting member. Mark.
Yes.
Peter.
Yes.
Rad.
Yes.
Okay, I think that's all the voting members that we have here this morning. So, all right, thank you for that. Bill, looks like you've been able to connect. Bill, could you just introduce yourself quickly? Bill Watson. All right. We'll move on then. Okay, next item on the agenda is talking about the Transportation Improvement Program. So I'm going to just jump into a presentation. Sharing my screen here. Again, I'm in the position of not being able to see anything up close without my glasses, and everything far away is blurry with them, so. All right. All right, can everybody see the full presentation there?
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, so we're here today to talk about the 2023 to 2026 TIP, as well as some minor updates that we're doing to the long-range transportation plan. I'm going to go start off with some sort of background information, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. I'm going to go kind of quickly through that, and then get into the more detailed information about the TIP document itself and about the plan, project updates for the plan as well. So we started a 30-day comment period on the TIP and the plan on January 6th. That will conclude early in February, the day before the commission meeting, so February 7th. We have a public hearing on the 8th at our MPO meeting. That's full commission meeting. That'll be at Stratham Town offices, and then it'll start at 7 o'clock. Once all the MPO TIPs around the states are approved, around the state of New Hampshire are approved, the NHDOT combines that into what's called the STIP, or the State Transportation Improvement Program, and that's submitted to Federal Highways and Federal Transit Administration for approval at that point. The one big piece that we have to be aware of in this is that our TIP and our long-range transportation plan must be consistent in that the TIP projects are shown with similar costs and timing in the long-range transportation plan. We take care of that by basically porting the TIP project table right into the plan itself. Oh, I just got that, Lucy. All right. Oh, thanks. All right. All right. So just a little bit of background on the documents that we're talking about, and we'll also be talking about a little bit about the 10-year plan, as that plays into this a lot. So we really have 3 planning documents in the transportation planning world that are sort of form the basis of a lot of the things that we do here in New Hampshire. The biggest or most widespread document is probably our long-range transportation plan. That's a 20-year horizon planning document. We talk a lot about all the various needs in the region, and we try to determine the congestion improvement needs, safety needs, all those types of things. And we talk a lot about projects mostly in a conceptual way in a lot of cases. The other document that's important to this process is the state 10-year plan. And again, that's a 10-year planning horizon document on that. And that's where those conceptual projects that we talk about in the long-range plan start to come to fruition and start to get into the queue for project development and for implementation. And then finally, we have the Transportation Improvement Program. That is a 4-year horizon document. So that's the most immediate 4 years here. And that's where the actual, the pavement gets put on the road, that kind of thing. And that's where Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration commit federal dollars to funding the projects that we've identified. And so those are where the projects are actually implemented. So the long range plan process, we have a sort of it's roughly on a 4-year cycle that we do updates to the major components of the plan. We do update our project list and ensure that it's fiscally constrained every 2 years, however. And so, the big role that the plan plays in the project development process is that this is our starting point for any time we're prioritizing for projects for the state 10-year plan. We start with the list of projects that we have in our long range plan and build from there. The 10-year plan cycle is one that is really, it's driven by the state and the Governor's Advisory Council on Intermodal Transportation, or maybe it's Commission on Intermodal Transportation. But we play a role at the very beginning and at the very end of the process. And so at the very beginning, we identify our priorities based on what we worked with the towns to determine what our priorities are. And at the very end of the process, we take the 10-year plan and start to develop our transportation improvement program out of the first 4 years of that document. So as I really put it here. So like the initial thing that kicks off the 10-year plan process really is the RPCs identifying their priorities in the, for regional projects. And then we provide feedback to DOT on the draft of the plan. We provide input to our executive counselor as to the contents of the plan and what our priorities are. And we present our planning process and our priorities at the hearings that occur around our region. And then there's a lot of work that goes in on the DOT side after that in terms of basically shoehorning all those regional priorities and all the state needs into that 10-year plan document and trying to make sure everything can be paid for. And then it comes back as a full draft and gets approved by the legislature and gets approved by the governor. And once that's approved, we take that approved 10-year plan document. We basically take the first 4 years of that and start developing our transportation improvement program from that. So and sort of the 10-year plan and the TIP and the plan all interact in that the draft project list from so our long range plan project list is what we use as the starting point for identifying 10-year plan priorities. And then once we get through towards the end of the cycle, the new draft project list at the end basically becomes the starting point for the development of our TIP document. So it's kind of, they're all connected and they all play together pretty well. So talking specifically about the transportation improvement program, I see I neglected to update the dates on this slide. This is actually the 2023 to 2026 TIP. So again, this is building off the 10-year plan document that was signed by the governor last summer. It incorporates all the information from any ongoing projects that are still in the works and are using federal funding, so that need to be listed in the document. We're adding 2 new years of projects on this, 2025 and 2026. And again, this becomes, the TIP is derived from the first 4 years of the 10-year plan, but it also becomes the first 4 years of the long range transportation plan. So again, these documents are all interconnected. The key difference in this case is that, this is where the federal agencies have committed funding specifically to projects, and we have more stringent fiscal constraint requirements in that regard, in that we must ensure that we can pay for everything that's in there. So what are we including in this update? We're updating our project listing and all the information that's related to it. The fiscal constraint documentation has been updated. We are updating the information in our public involvement section, our MPO system performance report, which is basically our report card, as well as technical updates to other components of the document. One of the pieces of that is looking at the projects that are in the current TIP, the 2021 to 2024 TIP, and see what the status of those are. And so this table illustrates that to some degree, in that we've completed or are in progress about 2/3 of the projects that are in that document, and almost the same amount of percentage of funding, at about $172 million worth of funding that's been implemented to date or is in progress. We of course have our regional transit agencies. We have 4 projects related to the regional transit agencies in the TIP, and those are included, and they could be included in that in progress or completed as well. We only had 12 of the projects that were delayed in the TIP beyond their initial years that they were expected to be completed. So 12 of those projects, at about 25% of the funding was delayed, and so would be incorporated into this new TIP document that we're adopting today, or working towards adoption today. And then we had 1 project that was dropped, and it was determined that project wasn't needed. I believe that was a planning study related to the transportation center in Portsmouth. So all in all, fairly good progress on the projects that were in the existing TIP, and continuing to move forward. So the current TIP document includes about $240 million in 40 projects around the region, $37 million in transit funding, some of which is going to the regional transit agencies, which in this case is Coast and Manchester Transit Authority, which includes the CART program as well as some of the inner city services, particularly the I-93 services included in this. And then in addition, there are 34 what we call statewide programs. that total statewide have about $540 million worth of funding in those. Those are projects that are groups of smaller projects that don't need to be listed individually in the TIP. And so they are things ranging from pavement rehabilitation and the paving program that the state runs, to things like the CMAQ program, where it's groups of projects developed by localities to be implemented, or the transportation alternatives program is included in that as well. Bridge rehab and work like that is included, and there's a whole gamut of sort of maintenance and preservation types of improvements that are in that, or projects that are included in those statewide programs. The key about those is that there's no sort of set programming of funding by region within that. So the state programs those statewide. So we all the TIPs around the state will include these full statewide programs. So talking about the regional projects specifically, this is just a summary of the funding in those projects. Again, about $316 million worth of regional funding projects. And you can see that that's fairly heavily distributed in the first couple of years and tails off in the last year of the TIP. This is not uncommon, as that last year of the TIP document is a little more nebulous in terms of the projects that'll be ready for that fourth year. But we start off with about $110 million in the first year, and by the fourth year, we're down to just under $40 million worth of projects in the region. Most of that funding is federal funding, and over 80%, with about 15% or 14% being state funding, and another 5%, 4% here, I guess, being local funding. In terms of phasing, in terms of preliminary engineer right away, or construction, or other phases, the vast majority of the funding is in construction. We have very little going to right away. Only 2% of the total funding in the program is going to right away, and about 4% going into engineering. The other category incorporates everything that is not preliminary engineering right away or construction. In this case, this is almost entirely transit funding in the region, although it can also include things like planning studies in some cases. But I believe all of this funding here is all the funding that's going to the transit agencies, and we have about $9 to $9.5 million a year going to the transit agencies. So looking at the projects in the TIP a little more specifically, the 5 largest projects in the region, this is always just a sort of a gauge as to, where the funding is being distributed to some degree. The biggest project in the region is the replacement of the 1A bridge between Seabrook and Hampton and Hampton Beach there. There's $88 million, almost $89 million in funding in that project in the TIP. The total project cost on that is just a little over $94 million. So it's a fairly heavy duty project, very big bridge, very major improvement. The next largest project is the replacement of the side barge wharf at the port in Portsmouth. This is sort of the last component of the replacement of the Sarah Long Bridge, and that's a $42 million project. Another bridge project, and this is a bike pedestrian improvement primarily. This is a replacement of the General Sullivan Bridge, the last component, one of the last components of the Newington Dover project. That's about a $33.5 million project at this point. Next largest, fourth largest is US 1 improvements in Portsmouth. This will probably do a little bit of capacity improvements and some other improvements along the stretch, basically between Ocean Boulevard or Ocean Road and Elwyn Road in Portsmouth. And that's about a $16 million project overall, $17 million overall, 15.5 in the TIP. And last of the top 5 is the very last component of the Plastow Kingston 125 improvements. This is the section that's basically from the Plastow border up to Hunt Road, Newton Junction Road in Kingston. And that's about a $17 million project overall, $12 million programmed in the TIP. All total, these big 5 projects are about 60% of the funding in our region. And so the remaining projects are a lot of much smaller projects, as you might guess. Our transit system funding is split out between Coast and Manchester Transit Authority, and then the Boston Urbanized Area 5307 funds, which is primarily the intercity services and other uses. So we see Coast is getting just under $14 million in 5307 funds. MTA gets a mix of 5307, 5310, and 5339 funding for various components of the work that they're doing there. And so that totals to about 23 million-ish in funding. And then the Boston urbanized area gets about $30 million in funding. And again, that goes to mostly the intercity services, but it also goes to some of the more other programs as well. So total funding for transit in the region, about $67 million.
And like,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and like the statewide projects, Coast serves 2 MPOs, MTA CART also serves 2 MPOs, so that isn't entirely for service in this region. That's MTA's entire network, including Manchester, and Coast's entire network that extends up into Dover, Rochester, Somersworth,
All right.
Farmington.
Yeah, that's a good point, Scott. Yes, so those are multi-regional programs. So Stratford Regional Planning Commission will include all of the coast information, and Southern New Hampshire Regional Planning Commission will include all the MTA information in their tips as well. So there's a number of projects that are new to the tip. Although some of them have been in the works for a while. They've come through the 10-year plan process, that sort of thing. So we have a red list bridge being addressed on 125 in Epping. This is just south of 101, right near the Brentwood town line. We have the Winnicott Road Complete Streets project, which was a transportation alternatives program project that is sort of trickled down from the 10-year plan in Hampton. Another 10-year plan project is some improvements at the intersection of 107 and 150 in Kensington. Newington, this environmental mitigation at the former Newington Country Store site. I believe this is another component of the Newington Dover project. Yeah, so that's one of the last pieces of that puzzle. Northampton Rye, the reconstruction of the revetment seawalls and berms. That's an entirely new project that came out of an analysis that the DOT has been doing over the last couple of years due to some of the damage those seawalls have taken in recent storms. Portsmouth, the Market Street, Russell Street intersection improvements. This is again a 10-year plan project that has basically come up in the queue. Also Grafton Drive intersection improvements at the Portsmouth Transportation Center. They're just inside the Pease Trade Port as another 10-year plan project. And finally, a project that has also come through the 10-year plan, this Route 1 capacity improvements in Seabrook from New Zealand Road to Hampton Falls Town Line. That's come back to the tip as well. That project was initially put in to the tip 3 or 4 years ago, an attempt to kind of fast track that. But things weren't moving and things weren't ready, so it got delayed out of the tip for a while, and now it's coming back. When I talked about the programmatic projects, there are 34 of those. I know if you look at all at the monthly tip revision reports that I send out, you'll see a lot of these projects show up. I'm not going to go through a lot of them, any of them really here, but they're really holding pots of money for funding of smaller projects that don't need to be listed individually in the tip. And they cover a lot of that statewide maintenance, preservation, and operational kind of work that the DOT does. So summary wise, there's about $540 million. Again, a large portion of that is federal funding. About 87% of that $540 million is federal funding. It's pretty well evenly distributed across the 4 years. Yeah, and so and again, the bulk of that funding is going into construction work, and with very little going into right of way, and somewhat more, but not a lot of money going into engineering. So in terms of changes that we're going to need to address for the final document, there's a couple of things here. We have a public input portal up. As of yesterday, we had seen 10 views of that engagement portal and no comments received through that. We have a handful of changes that we've identified that we need to make to the document. We're sort of still trying to figure out exactly how what that's going to look like exactly, but we know that these changes need to be made. The first is that Coast received a 5339B grant for a construction of their maintenance facility. And that includes about $7.7 million in federal funding And that needs to be added to the TIP document, and we're working with Stratford Regional Planning Commission, Coast, and DOT to figure out exactly what that's going to look like still, but it will be in the TIP document when we finalize it. Coast also received a US DOT Transit Infrastructure Bond Grant of $2 million for that same project that needs to be incorporated as well. It's still unclear at this point whether that'll be incorporated as a separate project or rolled into the 5339B grant. And again, we're working with Coast and SRPC and DOT to sort of sort that out in these next couple of weeks. The third request that we have is to take the funding that's in Portsmouth Maplewood Avenue Complete Street Project and shift that to the Beverly Hill Road bike and pedestrian improvements. The work on Maplewood Avenue has basically largely been completed using developer funds and other sources of funding. So that isn't needed for that project any longer. And the hope is that we can switch it over to that Beverly Hill Road, which is somewhat underfunded. So those are the three changes that we've identified so far. In addition to that, there's a couple other things that we're still working on. Probably the biggest piece of it is completing the system performance report. The system performance report is essentially, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's kind of a report card of what projects have been implemented, how has that changed or moved us towards our safety targets and our pavement preservation targets and our bridge improvement targets, those kinds of things. And how is the new program of projects in the TIP expected to further us towards those goals? It just takes a while to do this, and given the short time frames that we've had to get this developed so far, we're a little bit behind on that. So Scott and I have done some of the work on it, and it's in progress. We are shooting to have a solid draft done for the public hearing and the MPO committee meeting in a couple weeks, but it's going to be tight to get there. And the other two pieces of this are fairly minor. I think the work is largely done in those two cases. Basically ensuring that our project list is the appropriate project list and making sure that our financial constraint documentation is solid and accurate. And so I think those are in pretty good shape at this point. Still finding a few minor technical edits that I also need to make to the document occasionally, that sort of thing. Those are that's always the case, so that's not a big deal. But the big piece that's left really to be done is that system performance report. I'm going to jump right into the long range plan, and then at the end, maybe we take some time for questions or comments that anybody has. This should be a little bit a quicker piece. How am I doing on time? Running up. So long range transportation plan, again, this is a 20+ year horizon document that we update cyclically every 4 to sometimes it slides to 5 years. But we do try to update with every TIP update. We do an update of the project listing and the fiscal constraint analysis that we have in our long range plan. And this ensures that the two documents are consistent in the project schedules and the funding assumptions. So what we've done for the long range plan this time is, again, added any new projects that came in through the 10-year plan process or other studies and things like that. Like we had the vulnerability assessment we just did on the Seacoast. So the projects from that came into the plan, as well as anything that was proposed during the 10-year plan process from communities. So we've added those projects and we've shifted our project timing to ensure that the projects that we are listing in the first 4 years line up with the TIP. The projects in the 6 years after that line up with the 10-year plan. And then after that, we try to prioritize projects based on funding availability beyond that. So we are still working on a full update to the TIP, to the long range plan document that includes basically from start to finish, updating the whole document. We're hoping to get that completed later this year. So in the long range plan, we have just over 100 project listings, plus the nearly 50 that are included in the TIP. These touch on all surface modes, so bike, pedestrian, transit, and highway projects. We include in that estimates of future transit funding, turnpike funding, those statewide programmatic projects. We estimate how much of that we think might be spent in the region. all this basically does is give us a ballpark of how much funding we think is available in the region to be spent on projects. And so our estimate at this point is about $1.4 billion in projects between now and 2045. That includes the funding we expect to be available. So the first 4 years of that, again, that's the TIP document. So these numbers should match up really consistently with our regional project totals in the TIP. And that number should match up. And then 27 to 2032 timeframe, that's the last 6 years of the 10-year plan. So we try to match our project listings and timing in our long-range plan with what's included in the state 10-year plan. So you see actually a little bit less funding during that time period as the 10-year plan is a little more lean for us in the outer years. And then finally, actually, that should say 2033 to 2020 to 2045. That's the year, those are the years where we program all the projects that aren't included in the TIP or the 10-year plan. And so there is a lot of funding that we estimate to be available. We have a lot of projects that we've identified to take a lot of that funding out. So again, about 1.4, 1.5 billion roughly. Again, it's an estimate. So in terms of ensuring that our project programming is, we're not proposing to spend more funding in a year than we estimate to be available. We have to kind of spread out the projects to some degree. And this kind of, this chart talks about that to some degree, and it splits out the different types of projects. So we have our statewide programs as the basis of each column, our transit funding also forming kind of the base, the turnpike projects that we are aware of, and then the regional projects sit on top of that in the orange. The green shading behind is our estimate of funding availability. This doesn't show that really well in some cases because it's kind of hidden behind the columns. But it basically shows how the funding is distributed over the years of the long range plan between 2023 and 2045. I have another table, I think, that shows that a little better. So in the fiscal constraint assumptions, we have to make sure that we're consistent with what the other planning commissions are using, as well as what DOT is using. So we coordinate a lot of that work with those agencies. And so we have a consistent methodology that we try to use amongst all of ourselves to make sure everybody's using similar assumptions. And for that, we assume that the funds that are in the TIP, so the first 4 years, and those that are in the 10-year plan are equal to our regional share for those years. So anything that's programmed in those documents, our share of funding is that share, is that amount of funding. So whether it's $5 million in a year or $100 million in a year, that's our share of funding for that year. Beyond the 10-year plan, we take a share of revenues, basically of all the funding that we think is available statewide. And so that's based about, it's about 13.3% of federal funds we assume are coming to our region. And a little more of the turnpike funds, but we have a little bit larger share of the turnpikes in our region than other areas. And the federal funding that's based on our population estimate, as well as our lane miles of federal aid eligible highway. So, and that comes out to 13% of the total funding in the state. So we use that as the basis for saying, this is how much money we have available to do projects. On the cost side, we inflate our project costs at 2.8% per year, which, we know that's not a lot of inflation compared to what we've been seeing in the last couple of years. But overall, long term, it's a much better representation than assuming a very high inflation rate at this point. So, and the key in this is that in both the TIP and the plan, we can't program more funding for projects than we think is going to be available. And that's really the gist of all of it. And so I think this chart maybe illustrates that a little bit better than the previous one. So the green bars, that's our programming in the TIP. So the first 4 years, the black bars that sit on top of that are how much funding we think is available. So in this case, the programming in the tip and in the orange bars of the 10-year plan is available is exactly what the funding is available, no matter what that is, no matter how much that is on a year. So it's not a consistent amount. And then once we get into the long range plan years beyond the 10-year plan, so 2033 to 2045, we see that there's a little bit more leeway. We assume a certain amount of funding per year, and that grows a little bit over time. And we try to program the projects to fit within that. And you can see that the blue columns don't quite match up with the purple line at the top. And that's because it's really hard to match those up. But my goal was entirely to make sure that the blue line stayed below the purple line. Right. And so when I program the projects out. So everybody was sent as part of the packet, the full tip document, which includes all the project listings. And they were also sent the project listings for the long range transportation plan. And so you've seen all those project lists. So I'm not going to go into details on those today, but I'm happy to answer any questions people might have about them. There are a couple pieces that we still need to work on for this. First is, again, finishing that system performance report. There's one that we have to do for the tip, but there's also one we have to do for the long range plan. That is still in the works. And that larger update to the plan, that's still going to take a number of months to do. That'll be independent of this sort of update, but it's still in the works, and we're still working on that. So what we'll need from the TAC today, and again, after any discussion that people might want to have about projects or the components of the tip or the plan, what I'll need from the TAC is a recommendation for adoption of the 2023 to 2026 tip and the 2045 plan. So I'll need that recommendation to the MPO Policy Committee. This will include, again, those changes that I talked about needing to implement the Coast 5339B grant, the transit infrastructure grant that they received, and the shift of funds from Maplewood Avenue to Beverly Hill Road in Portsmouth, as well as any other comments that we receive. Both the plan and the tip, we are saying at this point that those are fiscally constrained, that they reflect our regional priorities. We've addressed transportation conformity, which is not something I really talked about today, and it's kind of something that sits in the background. We have to ensure that we are being consistent and in conformity with air quality regulations. So that discussion is included in the document. And then we make progress towards achieving our region's performance targets in both the tip and the plan. So that's kind of what we need today. So I'm going to exit out of the sharing the screen and then open it up to any questions or comments that anyone may have. Now that I've completely overwhelmed everybody with a lot of information.
I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
So I'm new to this, and I apologize if my questions are naive or ignorant, but I think I understand that the TIP document is updated every 2 years.
That is correct.
Okay. Next question. There is like a improvement plan on Route 33 between Stratham Hill Park and Winnicott Road that I didn't see on there. And I wonder if that is still going on.
Yes, it is. That's actually incorporated into one of those statewide programs that I mentioned. That's the Highway Safety Improvement Program. And so that project is sort of included within that larger program.
Okay, thank you.
So I think if maybe, let me just double check something here, but I think at the very end of the TIP document, I included a table of projects, and I guess I don't see it. Maybe it is Stratum. I need to double check on that, but oh yeah, no, I do. Table 16 in the TIP, which is at the very end, just before the appendix, includes those programmatic in DOT's sort of way of talking about these projects, those statewide programmatics are called parent projects. And the little projects that are underneath them are called child projects. And so I included a list of those child projects that I was aware of in the region in table 16 of the tip. And it's, like I said, it's at the very end. And Stratum Greenland is included in that, but that project is moving forward. So, and that is expected, I believe, that's starting work on that this fiscal year. So
Are the fiscal years aligned with the calendar years, or are they offset?
no, this uses a federal fiscal year, which is October 1st to September 30th. So
Okay.
current fiscal year will end in September this year. So I would expect DOT will be engineering of that this summer. So
Is it necessary for a project to be on the long-range transportation plan before it, is it a necessity to be there before it can be included in one of the tips?
most projects are, but it's not, it doesn't have to be. Sometimes projects come up it's a very new identified need. And I would say that Stratum Greenland project that you mentioned is in one of those types of projects where those are identified on a much more faster time frame than the tip updates and the plan updates. So those can be kind of added at any time in some cases. But a lot of the projects do come through the long range plan, but not all of them, I guess is what I'm saying.
There is an engineering study listed for the bridge on Route 33 over the Winnicott River. Can you prognosticate for me what that looks like in terms of becoming a reality?
Well, the engineering study is certainly going to move forward, and the analysis will be I think the analysis is kind of focused on improving the waterway there, if my memory is right, but it also will incorporate, what needs to be done to the bridge to improve the waterway and improve the flow of water through there. But that'll also include looking at the possibility of widening that bridge. Again, what the outcome of that is will depend on that study. So I can't really say whether that'll translate into another project, a construction project or not, but I think that outcome is likely, but I can't say for sure.
Do you know when the engineering study will begin?
Off the top of my head, I don't know if Bill or Lucy know off the top of their head, but let me just see if I can't. H, if I knew my alphabet, that would be helpful. Well, the funding is scheduled for fiscal year 2024. So that would be sometime after October 1st this year.
Okay, so October 1st this year is part of 2024.
Fiscal year 24, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm adjusting my understanding of fiscal years.
Yeah.
Dave, just to add to that, I know that there's a lot of local and political interest in moving that project along. So it'll be a lot closer to October 1st than it will be to September 30th of fiscal 24, if that's helpful as well. So
Yes,
I expect it will be moving on that quicker than slower.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate that.
Thank you. I think the focus in Greenland's view is the congestion created by Pease Development Authority, more so than the water issues, which we recognize are there. But the continued growth of PDA is just exacerbating traffic problems on a daily basis there. And we would like to make sure that that is considered as part of the focus of the project.
Yep, I'm sure it will be. I know the funding is coming through some sort of more environmental and water focused funds through the Department of Environmental Services, but so that's the project that's leading the project, but the congestion issues is certainly a big component of it that's considered. So that's not going to be ignored.
Great. Last question, is there a corridor study planned? I believe I heard from one of our visitors at one of our meetings that Route 33 corridor study was planned, but I didn't see it in the lists.
Yeah, we've identified Route 33 as being one of the corridors in our region. That's one of our priorities for a corridor study. But NHDOT has not indicated what projects will be funded as part of the statewide corridor study project that's listed. So we're not sure yet when that'll happen. We also have Route 111 in the western part of our region is also a priority, as well as there's a section of 125 between Kingston and Epping that really hasn't been ever looked at. Well, the whole rest of the corridor has been looked at. So we've got 3 in our region that are pretty critical for various reasons. So, but NHDOT makes those decisions, and it's not, and maybe with the input of the executive council. Or maybe that's vice versa. I'm not sure, Bill, maybe you can highlight that for me. But as far as we know, those decisions haven't been made yet as to what's going to be funded.
Thank you very much. Sorry I had so many questions.
No worries. Bill,
Dave, I will 30 seconds just to update them. So, and please don't apologize for the questions, Bob. They're all very good questions and very reasonable from our perspective as well. There is a statewide corridor study program. We are getting a lot of pressure to add New Hampshire 33 to that program. We have a consultant on board who has also one of the things that we have to do as we're starting this program is define what a corridor is. If I were to ask each of you, or if I asked a number of my staff what a corridor is, each of us would have a different definition probably of the length and the breadth, how wide on each side of a roadway or such would you consider a corridor to include. So that has a draft definition has been identified, a draft set of criteria for prioritizing corridors has been identified. And I have not seen it, but I know the person that's running the corridor studies project for us has also been working with our consultant and has a list of potential corridors and is comparing that to, like Dave mentioned, New Hampshire 33, New Hampshire 111, and others that have already been identified through the 10-year plan or GASSET or other processes. To see how well they overlay with each other. We expect the first, and the goal is to fund 2 corridor studies per year starting this summer. And we expect the first 2 corridor studies to start this summer, but I don't have a clue exactly which corridors they will be. But there is progress. It's been a lot of background work and a lot of delay and a lot of patience shown by many parties that are all interested in getting their corridors of importance to them looked at. But we are going to start seeing some concrete progress shortly.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Rad, you had your hand up for some questions.
Yeah, so I was just gonna mention the 2 projects that you're looking to add in are both, well, single project, but 2 awards. They're both discretionary awards that happened this year, sort of outside normal funding channels. So that's kind of the reasoning behind why these are getting added in the way they are. The other thing I'd say is in the long range plan, I think I saw in the notes or in the document that our facility project is listed as quite a bit more. Sorry, I'm thinking of the 21 through 23 long range transportation plan.
Okay.
I don't know if that needs to be updated in this one to a smaller dollar figure and a different project construction year. So
Well, I think, yeah, it'll definitely be shifted because once I get the project listed in the tip, I'll change the listing in the plan to reflect that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Dave.
So, and congrats on getting those grants, by the way. That's a big step for you guys.
Yeah, they were amazing awards.
All right. Any other questions on the tip or the plan?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, all right.
I see the New Hampshire interchanges, Route 101 interchanges as a
Yes.
general
project. I don't know if this is the right time, but we've talked about this internally. I've been talking with DOT about exit 9. You know, I think it should be spelled out. I mean, we've been working on that for a while. And I thought, you know, after I first got here, I thought putting it in the long range plan, okay, that's 30 years out. This is more of an immediate problem. Maybe we need to go. We had a meeting in Concord with DOT in 2019. Didn't really, you know, gave them a map of all the development that we thought was coming to this Epping Road corridor. You know, including, you know, several hundred units and, you know, hundreds of thousands of square feet of commercial industrial space. Nothing really came of that, except maybe talk about a corridor study. We took it on ourselves. We changed the tip. We got a corridor study. We did one ourselves that included the state exit 9 interchange down to the Brentwood Road in that corridor. We made several improvements. We widened part of Epping Road. We added a light, you know, within the town of Exeter limits. And now DOT's been calling and emailing me concerned about the projects. And I share that concern about exit 9 and the impact. So I think it really needs to, I know it's in here as this general unsignalized intersection from Raymond to Hampton.
Right.
I don't know if this is the forum or the time, but I'm just going to take every opportunity because we tried to go other routes to get a focus on that, but it hasn't seemed to have been focused on. So I'd like to put the focus on that intersection. It's the worst one from a safety standpoint in Exeter. The westbound off ramp and taking a left onto Epping Road. And we've approved over 550 residential units there. You know, there's a 224 unit project in the works that got approval, got some Invest New Hampshire money that's going to be built right next to the interchange. We've approved over 500,000 square foot of commercial industrial space in that area. So I just think I don't know, I've been talking about it, but this is maybe the time. Do we actually call it out in the long range plan or what?
Well, one thing on that is that there's the opportunity to apply for road safety audits, and the applications for that are due the 31st. And we've gotten data from the fire department on the crash history there, and that intersection, the ramps at exit 9 would qualify for an RSA. And so we're anticipating working with the town over the next week to finish putting that together.
Okay. I didn't know that.
We've looked through the application and we have, I think, the material that we need to do that.
Yeah, so I didn't know if it was, you know, put it, because like sometime I think about putting a project in here, you know, putting it 2048 time frame. It's like, okay, you know.
Yeah.
Well, that's one of the things with HSIP is the Highway Safety Improvement Program is once you've gone through a road safety audit, depending on the scale of the fix, it can qualify for HSIP funding, which can happen on a shorter time frame. I don't know if the fix there is going to be of a scale that is suitable for HSIP, but that's how the Stratham Greenland project was able to move forward relatively quickly, is that it's under HSIP.
Just concerned about that, safety for that intersection. The development that's coming is just going to impact that even more.
And we've left that in there as that kind of quarter study, looking at those unsignalized interchanges, because we don't have any idea of the cost or the improvements that are needed. And so that's where we've been kind of limited. If we have a specific project, like if the town has put together a proposal that is like, okay, we're going to signalize both ends of it, we know it's going to cost about this much, we can throw that in the long range plan, and that gets into the mix for the 10-year plan.
But it's not on right of that,
right?
You know, we've been designing right from Cronin Road. We have a $1.5 million project ready to go now.
It can still be put in the plan, even if it's not your roads. It's just, you know, DOT won't commit to doing anything that they're not comfortable doing, but we can get it in the plan, which at least gets it start to get on the radar. You know what I mean?
That would be great.
All right.
Much appreciated.
Sure. Any other questions that folks have? And
could I just ask a couple of quick questions?
Sure.
Just a minor thing, the link for the tip document in your memo doesn't work. Dave, I was able to find it easily on the website, but just in case you send that link out.
All right.
Yeah, I noticed that, but it also, you can get there on the link from the from the RPC page. That does work.
Sorry, thank you for pointing that out. I'm not sure what's going on. It did work when I set it all up, but websites are pain. So, all right, I'll check that. Thank you.
And when Dave was talking about exit 9, that reminded me of exit 12, which is technically an exiter, but you know, I kind of cringe every morning when I drive by it just because the line of cars is so long trying to get off the on-ramps there. So I'm wondering if there's that a good candidate for an RSA or something to kind of draw attention to that.
So in order to be a candidate for road safety audit, the site has to have had either a serious injury or a fatal crash at that site in the last 10 years, as well as no safety improvements implemented during that same time frame. And as far as I know, then no serious injury crashes at that location. A lot of crashes, sure, but none of them serious injury crashes or fatalities. You know, that's our quarter plan, our quarter study need for those unsignalized interchanges includes exit 12 as well. We'd also probably loop into that the I-95 101 interchange there. That off ramp is definitely hazardous as well, and over capacity at times. So and I know that's a priority of the DOT maintenance district as well, as that off ramp. So, you know, we're hoping that somewhere along the way, we can do some real work and understand what's needed at each of those locations.
Great. And last question, the corridor studies we're talking about, is that, maybe this is a question for Bill, but is that something that goes through the 10-year plan, the TIP usually, or is there a separate kind of pot of funding that you deal with those through?
That is 10-year plan funding.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a program that we were directed to create in the 10-year plan for corridor studies. And then out of that was also the ask to define a process for identifying corridors and then actually funding those priority corridors that were brought forward. So that's now moving. We're now moving into let's identify those priorities and get those studies done. That has not stopped some communities from proposing corridor studies as standalone projects as part of the 10-year plan recommendations. Although if those studies become priorities from a region, then we will need to figure out how to fit those into the corridor study program.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And we'll be talking about 10-year plan priorities at our next meeting. So that's be trying to finalize those. So that can be a good component of that conversation next month. So any other questions or thoughts folks want to share? All right. Going back to the need for a recommendation from the TAC to approve the 23 to 26 TIP and the updates to the 2045 long range plan. Get a motion on that from someone in a second.
I'll make a motion, we approve the TIP and the long range plan.
All right, thank you, Tim.
And this is Peter. I'll second that.
Peter, thank you, Peter. All right, I'm going to go through.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yeah, sure.
Just like, is that, I just mentioned exit 9, but that's, you know, is this the appropriate time or no?
We can talk about it. We can't add it to the TIP.
No, I know that. Okay.
Yeah, but we can talk about it and try to incorporate it into what I should do is probably incorporate so you'll notice in our long range plan tables, there are some projects in there with zeros for the costs.
Mm-hmm.
Those are ones that I don't have a cost estimate for. And so they're included because we recognize that there is a need there, but we don't have a cost for it. So we can't. So they're technically, they're called illustrative projects, in that we know there's something needed here. We don't quite know what. And we could do that with the 101 interchanges.
But would this be the appropriate
we can
time, or can we do it to, another meeting?
We could do it now, or it's easy enough to add that to the project listing, especially because it's illustrative and we aren't saying use this money for it. the other thing is, as we're working on that larger long-range plan update, we can incorporate it into that then as well. So over the next course of the rest of the year, we could incorporate.
Okay, why don't we just do that?
Okay.
Why don't we
Alright.
just do that?
You'd like to leave for us there for a minute, so.
Oh, okay.
Becky seemed to be back. So.
All right. All right. All right. So we have a motion in a second. I'm going to go through the list and get everybody's consent on this. So I'll start with the order I wrote people down for the attendance. So Dave.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Tim. Moore?
Yes.
Yeah. Bob.
I approve.
All right. Thanks. Eric.
Yes.
Right. Jen.
Yes.
Right. Jessica.
Yes.
All right. Mark.
Yes.
All right. Peter.
Yes, excuse me, yes.
Yep. And Rad.
Yes.
Right. And then I guess Bill or Lucy, if you want to vote or abstain. One of you is a designated voter.
I'll abstain.
All right. All right. And Ricky, I used Jessica as the voting person for this round. I'm not sure which of you is actually, I think Jessica is technically our TAC appointee, but so, all right. And Lee is not a voting member, and we're not going to ever let Sarah vote. So, okay. All right. Thank you. Again, this will be brought to the MPO at the February meeting on the 8th. And we'll have a full public hearing as part of that, and a full vote of the commission at that point. So, all right, thank you. All right, I took a little bit more time with that than I had anticipated, but next on the agenda, we have one of our land use planners here, Sarah, to talk about the recently completed regional housing needs assessment and how that might fit in with our identifying our transportation needs and other transportation improvements. So Sarah, I'm going to let you take it away, although I probably need to make you a co-host, don't I, so that you can actually share your screen.
It looks like I can share, so I think I'm okay.
All right, I'm making you a co-host anyway.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I apologize. I am having some issues with my voice, so I'm hoping that I can keep it strong throughout this presentation, and I'm going to try to keep my talking portion as brief as possible and leave some time for Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and share PowerPoint. Let's see. Make sure I can share properly. Okay. Can everyone see the full screen slides?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Great. So as Dave mentioned, I'm here to kind of give an overview of the recently completed regional housing needs assessment. There are a handful of folks on this call who saw my presentation 2 weeks ago, and there's definitely going to be some overlap. But for the folks who haven't seen the presentation, I thought it was really critical that we still included sort of all of the context of our key findings before we sort of dig into the overlaps with transportation and infrastructure as it relates to housing. I appreciate Dave's question about Epping Road and Route 9 earlier, because I think it directly gets to a lot of the points that I want us to kind of touch upon and talk about as part of this presentation. So to kick things off, so the purpose of the regional housing needs assessment is really to be an advisory document for our municipalities to provide data on housing and demographics by income level, so that each of our municipalities in the region can start to understand what their current and future housing need is. That's really sort of the key component of why we did this regional housing needs assessment. As part of this housing needs assessment, we conducted sort of a pretty robust public engagement outreach. We coordinated with all of the other RPCs across the state to sort of come up with a common framework for how we would put together the regional housing needs assessment document and the methodology behind collecting some of the data and ultimately our housing needs projections, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. We also conducted a handful of surveys, both regional surveys as well as statewide surveys, and hosted some community events and forums, as well as conducted some additional interviews with regional employers and other housing stakeholders. So I'm going to try to breeze through these pretty quickly just because I want to make sure I keep this meeting on time, but I do want to touch upon sort of each of the factors, the key findings that we found that are affecting regional housing. So first and foremost, so our regional population is increasing. You can see on this slide, the solid line is sort of the increase that we've seen in population from 2000 to 2020. And then the dotted line is the projected population that we're anticipated to see out through 2040. So we're projected to continue to grow as a region to around 220,000 by 2040. And then the population is projected to sort of taper off slightly in growth, so not grow at quite steady increase. Our regional population is aging, so the average age between 2010 and 2020 jumped from 43 to 47 for the region. This trend is true of almost all of our municipalities with a few exceptions. So almost all of our municipalities in the RPC region did see an increase in average age over that 10-year period. Our housing production has slowed. So as you can see here, building permits by year going back to 2000. Pre-recession, we saw pretty somewhat consistent building permits being pulled over 1,000 per year in the region. Around the, just before the 2008 recession, those numbers sort of steadily declined. And while we've increased housing production slightly, we haven't really gotten back to pre-recession levels of housing production. Cost of housing is increasing for both our renters and our homeowners in the region. So in the RPC region, the median gross rent between 2010 and 2022 increased by almost 50%. And the median home sale price increased over that same period by almost 100%. So we're seeing some pretty significant increases in cost of housing. Employment trends and immigration are changing the market. So folks who are buying homes in New Hampshire are coming from, yes, they're coming from New Hampshire, but we're also seeing an increase in those coming from outside states, including Massachusetts. We really saw an increase in 2020 and 2021 in those numbers of how many we saw buying homes in New Hampshire coming from out of state. And our current housing stock does not meet the needs of our communities. So there's a couple sort of data metrics that we can point to sort of back up that claim. When we're looking at the owner side of things for our ownership households, we want to look at sort of what the housing market looks like for sale housing. And one of the metrics that we can use to measure this is months to absorb on the market, which is basically how many months it would take to sell the entire inventory of active listings at the current pace if no new listings were added. So you can see here on the, I believe it would be on your left-hand side of the slide, there's sort of a steady decline from 2010 to 2021 of how many months it would take to absorb the entire inventory of active listings. In 2010, it was approximately 6 weeks that it would take. And in 2021, we saw that it would take less than 1 week to absorb the entire inventory of active listings if no new listings were added. And then to look at sort of the renter side of things, we can look at vacancy rates for renter occupied housing in the region. Similarly, between 2010 and 2022, we saw a pretty significant decline in vacancy rates. In 2010, the vacancy rate was just over 3%. And in 2022, it was about 0.5 percentage, 0.6%. A healthy rental vacancy market has a 5% vacancy rate. So while even in 2010, it was below that sort of 5% balanced market, we've seen an even steeper decline in vacancy rates. And then the other kind of metric I have on this slide is for us to consider sort of those in our region that are either very low income or extremely low income as defined by HUD. And that's to look at our housing choice vouchers. So in our region, we have about just over 1,000 folks using housing choice vouchers, otherwise known as Section 8 vouchers. And then we also have 55 voucher holders in our region who currently have vouchers, but have not been able to find a housing unit that will allow them to use that voucher. So they're sort of currently seeking housing where they can use their housing choice voucher, even though they've already been accepted into the program. And then we have over 1,200 folks who are actually on the wait list to receive a housing choice voucher. So while we have a good amount of folks currently housed using a housing choice voucher, there's still even more folks who are on the wait list to receive a voucher to be able to use that towards their housing. And then the other piece that we can look at is sort of how our housing stock aligns with the current needs of our community is to look at cost burden. So what I mean when I say cost burden is that as defined by HUD, to be a household that is technically cost burdened by your household expenses, you would be spending 30% or more on your total household expenses. So to be a non-cost burden household, you would be spending less than 30% of your total household income on your housing expenses, which would include rent, utilities, it would include your mortgage, your taxes, utilities, etc. So for our owner households, just over a quarter of all of the owner households in the region are currently considered cost burden, meaning that they're spending 30% or more of their total household income on housing expenses. For our rental households, we've got about 42% of all households in the region spending 30% or more of their income on housing expenses, which is a significant indicator that a lot of our households in the region, both owner and rental, are sort of spending more than what is recommended on their household expenses. Just going to pause to take a sip of water. Okay, and then lastly, income has lagged as housing prices to continue to increase. So we saw housing prices have increased pretty sharply between 2010 and 2022. And while income has also increased, it isn't keeping up at the same pace. So the chart that you have in front of you is actually looking statewide at home values as they relate to median income. So the solid line, the solid blue, dark blue line is actually New Hampshire home values. And you can see between 2000 and 2021, you can see the increase. The dashed line at the bottom, the dark line, is New Hampshire state median income. And you can see, well, yes, it's also increased over the last 20 years. It's not increasing at the same rate as our household home prices have increased. So what does this mean? So clearly there's supply challenges, there's demand challenges, there's cost and market challenges, but there's also a lot of other factors that are going to impact the future of housing in our region. These things are going to include climate change, how our municipalities are handling and regulating short-term rentals, the economy, which directly relates to construction and labor costs. The pandemic since 2020 has shifted things significantly in how the housing market is responding to demand. And then also how we plan as a region for housing. So thinking about our infrastructure planning and our land use planning, which is sort of where we're intersecting today's conversation with the work that this group does. So the last component I want to kind of dig into a little bit of the housing needs assessment is the housing needs projections. So as part of the assessment, we took a look at sort of projecting out what the regional need for total units would be over the next 20 years, so between now and 2040. And we worked with a third-party consultant, Root Policy Research, to come up with sort of a common methodology that, as I mentioned, was used across the state with all 9 RPCs to project out how many future housing units are needed based off of projected population growth and projected employment growth. For our region, the projected need is just over 14,500 total new units by 2040. The model then breaks this up into sort of renter occupied units as well as owner occupied units. And then it further breaks it out into sort of workforce housing qualified owner units and renter occupied workforce housing qualified units. So that's sort of what this chart is showing. And I want to not get too into depth just so that we have time to talk about sort of other things as part of this presentation, but I can certainly come back to this if folks have questions at the end. And one thing I just want to highlight about this housing needs projection model is that there are some limitations to the model. There are limitations to every model out there. There are a lot of assumptions that have gone in to create the, to produce the numbers that we're looking at. And some things that were kind of excluded from the model is it doesn't take into account our seasonal units. So the demand for seasonal units, which is a critical piece, especially in some of our coastal communities that we need to consider as well. It doesn't take into account units in poor condition that are on the ground or units that have been demolished in recent years. And also housing markets are really difficult to predict. So there's going to be other external factors such as how interest rates change over the years, economic factors, public funding and policy. But this data is, this model has really been produced using the best possible data available. And it's based off of future projected growth. So it's not taking into account sort of what's existing on the ground. We're just looking at what the future projected growth is based off of population projections and employment growth projections. Okay, so as I mentioned, we kind of understand that's the background of, we have some housing challenges that are facing the region, facing the state, facing the country, and really even, internationally, there are absolutely housing challenges around the globe. So the next step is sort of what do we need to consider? What factors do we need to consider when we're planning for housing? Especially at the regional level. There are a lot of different levers a municipality can control that impact housing opportunity, including our land use regulations, various policies of whether or not to implement certain policies, other controls such as which could be zoning, it could be promoting things like infill development, redevelopment, how you're allowing for multifamily building, construction, et cetera. And then there's also infrastructure concerns. So that's what we're going to focus on today is really the transportation piece. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of water and wastewater infrastructure. And then lastly, there's also what I call housing economy and community development, which is sort of thinking more about the equitable housing piece as well to developing and opening up housing opportunities. Okay, so infrastructure and transportation networks. So how does housing intersect with transportation planning? And how do we ensure that our infrastructure can support housing growth? So, Dave's question, I think, was really timely to my presentation. Thanks, Dave. Our communities, our municipalities are facing this housing challenge and starting to think about which of those levers can we control and can we move to be able to encourage housing opportunity in a way that is appropriate for our community specifically. And in order to do that in a really effective and sustainable planning way, we need to think about our infrastructure and specifically our transportation infrastructure and our water and sewer infrastructure. So in order to sort of target housing development and ensure that we're providing equitable housing opportunities across income and demographic groups, we want to make sure that we're locating housing in areas where residents have access to daily needs. So whether that be with or without a vehicle, making sure that our housing is being constructed in areas that are, relative to employment centers, public transportation hubs, that housing developments have good food access, access to civic infrastructure like recreational opportunities, libraries, parks, things of that nature, and then also access to our medical services. So that's sort of the equity piece of it. But there's also other really important benefits to locating housing near major transportation networks, which include, benefits to the environment. So reducing air pollution when we can reduce commute times down, reducing congestion, traffic congestion. In Greenland, the issue with PDA and increased traffic based off the employment center that's there is something that should be considered in sort of the proximity of where we're citing our housing development and our housing growth. And also reducing vehicle dependent households and reducing household costs overall. So when you have access close by to local transportation networks that can, efficiently and effectively move you to your daily needs, whether that be your employment center, childcare, the grocery store, wherever you need to go, it's going to decrease your household costs overall. So some of the considerations that we need to make include potentially zoning to allow for transit-oriented development. So making sure that we are allowing for, medium density housing where there's opportunities for public transit or transit hubs. Considering streetscape improvements is also really critical when we're thinking about having medium or higher density housing development. Considering what our parking requirements are. So as I mentioned, reducing vehicle dependent households and considering how much parking do we actually need to require from a municipal standpoint. Roadway improvements to meet that increased traffic demand and that increased congestion based off of increased housing growth and other implications of housing growth on our transportation networks. So really, it's going to be critical that we connect ongoing and plan transportation improvements with our housing land use regulations to increase opportunity for housing development in targeted areas. So as Dave was speaking, there's projects that have been approved in that area of Exeter for significant housing growth and development. And we need to make sure that the conversations are happening where we're linking that development and where we're hoping to grow our housing development with what planned transportation improvements are coming down the pipeline, which is so critical when we're thinking about long-range planning, both from a housing development standpoint, land use regulation amendments, as well as transportation projects. And then the other sort of key component is going to be this water and wastewater infrastructure. Hang on, I'm going to take a sip of water. So all housing requires clean drinking water and a way to dispose of their wastewater. I'm just seeing a question in the chat, which I'll get to. So housing development should be considered potentially where there's existing water and sewer infrastructure is going to be really critical, but also where there might be possibilities for connections or extensions of water and sewer infrastructure. Higher density housing development may support expansion of infrastructure, whereas lower density residential areas are going to face more challenges in developing higher medium density housing. It's possible there are ways to do it, but it's absolutely going to probably have additional costs associated with it, and there will be additional challenges. So what we attempted to do as kind of an additional component of the regional housing needs assessment, that sort of a very base level analysis that, the hope is that we can continue to sort of dig into this analysis as we continue with sort of the implementation of some of the action items recommended as part of this assessment, is we took a look at sort of housing opportunity with the lens of infrastructure exclusively. So we wanted to find out, okay, we have this regional projected need of 14,500 regional units that, need to be developed to fulfill projected need between now and 2040 in our region. So what does that actually look like based off of the realities of existing infrastructure and potential extensions or connections of infrastructure on the ground? And by that, I mean really that transportation network piece, as well as the water and sewer infrastructure. So we did sort of a co-occurrence mapping exercise where we took out all of the land area that included natural features, man-made infrastructure, so our roads, conservation land, etc. We removed existing developed land uses. So we took out all sort of built out land, and we added buffers around our major roads and our water and sewer infrastructure lines. And then we sort of weighted areas around those specific infrastructure pieces. So, you know, if you were within a half mile of a major road, you were given 3 points. If you are within 500 feet of a water or sewer line, you were given 2 points. And we sort of created a co-occurrence based off of that. So this map shows, we've overlaid state roads as well as federal roads to this map, but the green areas have a score of 7 or above. So those are areas that are sort of based off of where existing infrastructure, water and sewer transportation networks are. Those areas are weighted as higher opportunities for higher, medium or higher density housing development, whereas the red areas, you sort of see, you know, orange and then red is the lowest weighted areas. Those are going to be the areas that are maybe less ideal for increased housing development growth based off of proximity or lack of proximity to transportation and water and sewer infrastructure. So this map, I think, is really critical when we're thinking about our long-range planning and how it's going to relate to our land use regulations over time. And like I said, this is sort of just a first pass at this analysis. And this is absolutely something that we could dig into on more of a municipal level, or looking across municipal boundaries at where there's potential for connections of our infrastructure. And then sort of overall next step for the housing needs assessment. So, you know, today I really wanted to accentuate the importance of municipalities making land use decisions hand in hand with infrastructure decisions. So being aware of what projects are being identified, funded, and implemented, and how those projects relate to land use regulation and policy decisions that are being made at the municipal level, and how that potential increased capacity of our housing development and our housing growth is going to be handled by those infrastructure improvements. But for sort of overall high level, what the next steps for the housing needs assessment are, we will see in the next 6 months a statewide toolbox is being developed, which will include sort of a suite of tools available to support housing development for both local actions, including like zoning amendments, engagement and education recommendations, and housing and policy and legislation actions that communities can take. At the regional level, the RPC is sort of working to identify what the best possible next steps are based off of input from our municipalities to decide what conversations we want to have, who we want to bring to the table, and if we can host some stakeholder roundtables where we can start to have these conversations of what makes sense at a regional scale. And then lastly, local action. So in the housing needs assessment itself, there's sort of a suite of, you know, not necessarily recommendations, but sort of a suite of like menu options that our local communities can take, you know, on a community by community basis, what makes sense for our local communities to start tackling as they begin to identify those housing goals and work towards tackling some of these challenges that we're seeing with the housing market. And then lastly, before I open it up for sort of questions and discussion, I want to note we're in the process right now of, we don't have the final document published yet for the housing needs assessment. It's currently in the hands of the graphic designer, but we hope to, by the second week of February, have the final document produced and published and sent out to our listservs and posted on our website. But we do have an opportunity for folks to provide input on our website. So if you go to sort of the regional housing needs assessment page on the RPC's website, it's a comment box where we can take questions and comments, and we're working to compile a frequently asked questions sort of document that we can then submit out. There's also additional information that has been uploaded to that website in regards to that sort of housing needs projection and fair share table as well. So if folks are curious to see the methodology and additional information on that, they can find it on the website. But really, I want us to think sort of more about, as transportation planners, what other considerations or connections between housing and transportation planning do we need to consider, and how do we best coordinate between the decisions that are being made, from a land use policy and regulation standpoint, with sort of the projects and the implementation and the funds that are coming, through the transportation planning process as well. That's sort of the big question that I want to leave you folks with today. And I will stop sharing and pause for a moment, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments. And I'm going to take a sip of my water. I think I saw.
I'll throw a question out at you, Sarah. So the co-occurrence analysis that you did, do you think that could be used as a decent metric for us to make decisions about transportation projects as well? Like if, basically giving each proposed transportation project a score based on where it sits in that, whether it's an area that scores 7 above or lower, you know what I mean? Do you think that is a reasonable metric to use for that?
I think it could be. My one recommendation would be to also take into consideration the existing zoning around that area, and connect with, if you're looking at a specific municipality, connecting with the planners in that municipality to determine if there's potential zoning amendments that are coming down the pipeline that might change existing zoning. But thinking about, so one thing that co-occurrence does not take into consideration, which might be kind of the next step, is, okay, the areas that are scoring a 7 or above might be great from an infrastructure standpoint for housing growth or development, but they might not be zoned for housing at all. So kind of connecting that land use regulation piece with the infrastructure piece is really, I think, the critical piece of like what we're missing in a lot of aspects.
Okay.
And those are just a couple factors, right, that go into housing development. But as I sort of highlighted, there's a handful of other controls that our municipalities need to be thinking about when they're citing housing development. So that's just sort of one piece of the equation.
Okay, all right, yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think you and I had talked the other day about how I think we could use this also for a regional travel demand model to do sort of from future scenario planning, where if we focus if we understand there needs to be, let me step back. The land use side of our regional travel demand model generates traffic so the travel demand model generates traffic based on land use, and that translates back to housing on the people side. Instead of population, we use housing, and we use employment on the commercial side. So, but we can target the housing to specific areas of the region, and if we know that we need roughly 15,000 more units, we can use maybe that co-occurrence map to just make that distribution as a scenario and say, okay, if we focus all the housing growth into these areas, which seem to be kind of primed for the best spots to put the housing, what does that do to our travel patterns and congestion and that kind of thing? So I think that's a good opportunity for us to really build on that work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Were there some other, I know Lee had put something in the chat there. I don't know. So maybe Lee, you could summarize what you put in the chat.
Yes, I'm just reading it out.
Yes, I'm sorry for all the stuff I put in there, but I'm just sitting here getting very excited because as I said in the chat box there's a lot of provisions in the new legislation under the bipartisan infrastructure law to have MPOs really consider housing in the metropolitan transportation planning process. And so if you want more specific information, it's there in the chat box, but I think this assessment you're talking about, Sarah, is just a really great opportunity to get at some of this, the intent of what we're trying to do here with the legislation, to get, that consistency between transportation improvements and state and local housing patterns. So I don't have a question. I'm just very, very excited at the work that you're doing. And I think it fits really well with this sort of new, initiative or provision of the legislation as it relates to what MPOs should be doing with their planning process. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lee.
Mark, looks like.
Thank you, sir. That was interesting. It'd be interesting to see what the zoning is for that infrastructure map. Like, does the zoning allow you to put housing in those areas that are super green? And then I had some questions about how you came up with that. There's some areas that are kind of light up green and stratum, and generally we don't have water sewer, and that's, I know when we talk to developers, that's kind of the big thing that they're looking for in order to get any density. So I'll probably just reach out to you over email, but be interesting to see how you came up with that.
Yeah, definitely. We can chat more in depth about it as well. But likely what's happening in those areas is that even though there might not be existing water and sewer, it might be in close enough proximity that it still got points to whatever lines. And then that coupled with the proximity to the transportation could have, spiked it high enough to light up green. So potentially an opportunity for like a connecting point would be my guess. But yeah, we can definitely look at it closer. Absolutely.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I guess I have more of a comment than a question. It seems like, we know we need to tie transportation and land use. We've been talking about that for as long as I've been attending planning and transportation meetings. It seems like we always do things backwards. We build the houses and then we don't have the transportation infrastructure to support them. It seems like our goal maybe should be, if we're going to add 14,000 more people in our area, maybe we should be adding 28,000 public transportation daily trips to support the people that are going to be here. I don't know how we exactly implement that, but it seems like we should keep that in mind.
That's a good point, Tim.
Yeah.
Hey, Dave, I'll jump in if no one else is. Part of the reason we made that attempt at the infrastructure map sort of speaks to what Tim is saying. It's sort of the whole process of the fair share and regional housing needs rubs me the wrong way a little bit, because it tries to distribute these housing units across the region into rural areas, which ultimately forces people into vehicles and more vehicle trips. And as all the land use planners will say, it's just not good land use practice, right? You want to not sprawl things out and spread things out. You'd rather try to get the little bit of density where you can have it and give people that opportunity to live a lifestyle where they're not driving for 2 hours a day to get to work, right? So yeah, transit would be a component that we should look at. And then also to Mark's point, we didn't include zoning because it varies so much across each town. Honestly, we didn't have the capacity or the resources to do it in this past. And zoning can change probably easier than roads and infrastructure. So, but I think we could dive in on a town by town basis and look at your zoning with the analysis that we did
and see how that works, and then play around by changing the zoning to see how the colors light up differently that co-occur. And so there's a lot of opportunity to do things here, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to do that with the support of Federal Highway and DOT.
All right.
FDA.
And FTA.
FTA, yep. So, all right, I hate to cut this short, but we have at least one more item that we have to get to today on this. So thank you, Sarah, for your presentation and your help today on that. But we need to move on, and we're going to talk about the submitted CMAQ proposals. I did have an item on here to talk about the work program, our next planning work program, that unified planning work program. That is the work that we do here in the office over a 2-year period. And basically I was looking to get input from folks as to if there's initiatives or planning work that they think we should be specifically undertaking during that time frame. So if you have something like that you think, Dave, you really need to be working on this over the next couple of years, shoot me an email or something about that, and we'll try to see if we either have it already incorporated or can incorporate that kind of work given our resources. But I'm going to turn it over to Scott now to handle the CMAQ proposals. I'm going to give you that.
So you don't necessarily need time to.
I don't necessarily need time to talk about that. It
Okay.
was something I'd hoped to get to, but I don't think we're going to be able to. So,
Alrighty.
gotta share the screen.
Alrighty. So we wanted to give you a preview of project applications that were received under the Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Improvement Program. Projects that were submitted that impact the region, whether those were submitted by communities in the region or by other entities that may cross regional boundaries. I think most of the people still on the call here are familiar with CMAQ. It's a Federal Highway Administration program that supports projects that improve air quality and or reduce traffic congestion. Project types can include intersection improvements that facilitate better traffic flow and reduce backups, intelligent transportation system or ITS projects like signal coordination, bicycle and pedestrian projects, or transit projects that encourage mode shift and get people out of cars and instead taking alternate modes of transportation that reduce congestion and have fewer emissions. So this has been a two-step process. What do we got here? As these have been in the past, there were letters of interest that were due earlier in the fall. And then everybody, each applicant that submitted a letter of interest needed to participate in a mandatory pre-proposal workshop, and then full proposals were due. Full proposals were due in January. So at the statewide level, we have $30 million in federal funding for this region, and that's over a 4-year period beginning in 2025. There were 46 full proposals that were received, requesting $44.6 million in comparison to that available $30 million pool. So about 150% of the available funds. In the RPC region, letters that were submitted earlier in the year, 13 letters were submitted, or project letters were received. Full proposals that were received in January, there were 10, and those came several each from Portsmouth and Stratham, one from Coast in cooperation with RPC and SRPC that I'll talk about in a minute. And then several proposals from private entities for constructing electric vehicle charging facilities around the region. So the federal funds requested across those 10 proposals that we're looking at in our region included $5.7 million. So, and here's a table just summarizing those. City of Portsmouth submitted 3 projects. One of those is reconfiguring the intersection of US 1 bypass and Coakley Road. Folks who've driven south on the bypass from the Portsmouth traffic circle know that there are currently 2 traffic lights in close proximity, Coakley Road and Borthwick Ave, and that the closeness of those can snarl traffic. And so this would be eliminating the light at Coakley, putting in a median strip there such that traffic coming out of Coakley, I believe, could only head south on the bypass. And then there's also a connector road that would allow traffic coming off of Coakley that wants to go north to cut over to Borthwick Avenue. So Portsmouth also submitted a project for EV charging stations. These, I believe, are level 3 DC fast charge stations. And then extension of the multi-use path on Market Street that would take it, I don't have the full project description in front of me, but I think going from Eric, is it Albacore out to Woodbury?
From Kearsarge out to,
Kearsarge.
yeah. Out to
Right, so Kearsarge Way, where the Albacore sub is. And then Town of Stratham, signal coordination project on Route 108 Portsmouth Avenue, coordinating 5 traffic signals between 101 north to the signal that's going to be installed at Bunker Hill Avenue. And then also an EV charging station project. In this case, that is level 2 charging facilities at charging equipment that would go to a number of town facilities. Coast, in cooperation with RPC and SRPC, submitted a proposal to revitalize the Commute Smart Seacoast Transportation Management Association, essentially bringing back a full-time director and outreach person for that program. That was something that had been a mitigation effort as part of the Newington-Dover Little Bay Bridges construction project, and worked with major and smaller employers in the region to raise awareness of options other than driving alone, whether that's carpooling or riding coast, bicycling and walking, and was quite effective, and had actually won a national award. And then you see 4 projects that have been submitted by private entities, one by Revision Energy for charging facilities in Portsmouth, 2 by Nuria Energy, one for charging facilities in Exeter, one in Salem, and then one by New Sunset Realty for a facility in Raymond. And all 4 of those are also the level 3 DC fast charge. So all told, you can see total project cost of about 7.1 million, and then the federal share 5.7 million. So the criteria on which these will get evaluated, there's a 2-stage evaluation process. We'll evaluate these at the regional level and come up with a regional ranking, and then our regional rankings get sent to DOT. There'll be a subsequent statewide ranking process. We anticipate that we will use the statewide ranking criteria for our regional evaluation here. These are pretty consistent with the criteria from the last CMAQ round as well, with 15 points related to project readiness, 15 related to financial readiness, 25 points related to stewardship and sustainability, And then 35 points related to the air quality benefits that the project will yield. And then 10 points related to regional rankings. So a task for staff in the next month, well, really in the next 2.5, 3 weeks, is developing air quality analyses. And the department and the regional planning commissions have discussed using a set of federal FHWA templates for estimating the air quality analysis, so that projects in each region are being evaluated with consistent templates. And so these essentially are the template categories. There are a couple of projects that may not fit exactly into these, such that we need to come up with an alternate template, thinking in particular of the Transportation Management Association, sort of a transportation demand management initiative. But there are other examples of that, of good templates for that sort of project. So the timeline for the funding round, the letters of interest were due back to DOT or back in the fall. Full applications came in January. We just got the full list from DOT of the applications for which we'll be doing our air quality analyses. So remainder of this month, first half of February, we'll be developing the air quality analyses, and then a staff and committee review of projects. Now, committee review is something we wanted to talk about. I think in the last CMAQ round, the last TAP round, we have asked for, say, 3 members of the TAC who would be willing to review these projects with us, so that the list and the draft rankings that we bring back to the TAC at the meeting in February are not coming solely from staff, but TAC members from communities that have not submitted projects can also bring a voice to this. And we think that's particularly important in this case, since the Planning Commission has worked with Coast on that Commute Smart project, so that we're not evaluating our own project. So then the TAC meeting in February, TAC will meet and evaluate the material and the staff and committee rankings, come up with a recommended ranking to be sent to the policy committee. We'll bring this to the policy committee at their meeting on March 8th. And then we need to send our final regional rankings to DOT by March 24th. So that's kind of a quick thumbnail. Do folks have questions about this? And do I have any volunteers who would be interested to participate?
Do you want to stop the share so we can
see
people?
On the Scott, on the question about the projects that you guys are working on, you guys being RPC are working on, and you don't want to evaluate, you're presumably talking about the Coast type projects that, so obviously Coast members wouldn't be working on evaluating those, but you probably need somebody with transportation experience in that area, as opposed to just a general, you know, obviously Kingston hasn't put any proposals in, so I mean, I would be qualified to hear the stuff, but I think my learning curve would have to be increased quite a bit. I think you'd be better off with somebody who's an expert on urban transportation, bus routing, things like that.
I think
we do have a model for doing the air quality analysis, and data are available. So how we've done this in the past is we have kind of a 1-page project overview form that we take the application information, put that into a summary, and then we have a set of data and the assumptions that go into each of the air quality analyses. So we would prepare for that committee or that subcommittee of the TAC. We'd prepare all the information for your review, and then you can take a look at those data and question the assumptions that go into them.
Yeah, the role of the TAC in this case, or the subcommittee of the TAC, the volunteers, would be to help us prioritize the projects ahead of the TAC meeting and so that we get a more sort of fair understanding of what regional priorities should be as opposed to just coming from staff members. But we'll do the air quality analyses and we'll assemble all the data on that side of it. So we just need interest, I think, more than expertise.
Okay.
I'd be willing to help out. I've done that a few times before.
Hey, Tim,
How many people you need?
3 ideally.
I don't have any projects. I did see, well, I just found out there was an Exeter project in there from a private Noria Energy. I didn't know that until 30 seconds ago, but I'd be happy to do it. The town of Exeter doesn't have any projects.
Okay. Peter,
Unless someone else wants to, take it.
okay,
If you need a third, I'll do it.
okay,
If there's anybody else that's interested and wants to participate, we welcome the participation too, so.
it can be more than 3, but we wanted to have 3 as a starting point.
Okay.
So if others have an interest, let me know and we can add you to the list. But I think Tim and Dave and Peter would be a great subcommittee.
All right.
Thank you much.
All right, thanks. Okay.
Just one more question, just to
shoot.
What's a non-participating roadwork mean? That's in the Coakley Road realignment thing. I just wanted to get a definition.
Yeah, a piece that's not being funded with CMAQ money. So the city, that connector road that I mentioned between Coakley and Orthwick, I believe is being proposed with city to be done with city funding, not with federal funding. So that's the component that's considered non-participating.
Okay, that's all I want. And that looks personally to me like the hardest part of the whole project. I looked at the overview, the aerial map, and I didn't see any place we connect those two because there's private houses in there, but that's that's their problem. Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay. All right. Thanks. So yeah, we're not going to talk about the work program. When I send the post TAC meeting, I'll send a link to this video. I'll send the presentations that we did today. I'll also send a link to our current work program. So if folks want to weigh in on what we should have in the next one, you at least have something to base from. Again, that's something we're working on. We'll probably talk about it a little bit more at the February meeting as well, but we'll be looking to sort of have a final draft at that point. Actually, we'll have a final draft at that point. We'll be looking to approve a final work program at the February meeting. So sooner rather than later is better for that, but I'll explain that all in an email. Project updates, we'll attach our usual memo to this email as well that updates folks on some of the other projects that are occurring in the region. So if nobody has anything else they'd like to discuss, I'd like to call the meeting to a close. Anybody have any final comments?
No.
Nope. All right, hearing none. We have reached 11 o'clock and actually 11:02. So thanks everybody for their time this morning. And we'll see you next month.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good day.
You too. And do we need the recording? That's up on the corner there. I think you can hit this.